I see all of our panelists are here, so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists and myself. First, we have Suwa Mohamud, student leader and agent of change at the University of Maryland. Next, we have Diane Krejsa, Deputy General Counsel at the University of Maryland. We have John Bertot is both a professor and associate provost for faculty affairs here at Maryland. And we have Captain Moss is a senior member within the University of Maryland Police Department and also serves on the hate bias response team. And last but not least, we have Neijma Celestine-Donnor, Program Director of Bias Incident Support Services within the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us for this incredibly important conversation today. So my name is Neela Wilson, and I'm the Advisor for Retention Initiatives in the Student Success Office within the Office of Undergraduate Studies. So I'll be helping to moderate the discussion today. Before we begin, as each panelist responds to initial questions, I ask that you please reintroduce yourselves for the audience members. So we can go ahead and get started with our first question. And you can speak in whatever order you would like if you want to just jump in. Why do you think that there are tensions between inclusion and free speech on college campuses? And how have you seen this tension in your work or interactions?
I'm happy to jump in under that one. So I think in my particular role, I see this need to want to ensure that we have diversity and inclusion and equity. And at the same time, it has been difficult to balance that with free speech a lot, because in many ways, the students and the population that I serve, which tends to be mostly folks that are marginalized, often feel that the First Amendment was not created or written with them in mind, right? And so that there is not always equal access to the ways in which people are allowed to practice free speech. There's also some tension around, yes, we understand that, you know, someone has a legal and constitutional right to engage in this, but their action is causing me pain, right? And is very harmful to me. And are you saying then that my pain doesn't matter? And some ways, particularly, I will say for Black folks, oftentimes the message that they receive is that Black pain doesn't matter. Because when you tell me that this person is doing something that is legal, you're also saying that the pain that I've experienced is not important or not valued. So I think that creates some tension based on what I see and what folks have said to me.
I'd like to add on to what Neijma said. It's absolutely beautiful. I wanted to add on, yes, as someone who's a part of the Black community on campus as a student, I've seen free speech be used more as a form of weapon against marginalized students, and the sense of a lack of accountability for people who use it, and their intent to use freedom of speech as a means to put down and to harm and cause pain to marginalized students. So I think there's that dichotomy between freedom of speech and inclusive language, because fundamentally, if they're both used together, like they both can work together. It's just the freedom of speech that I have witnessed a lot in my life and on campus is more of centered towards using a weapon more against students who don't necessarily fit the white male cisgendered role.
This is Diane Krejsa. Hello. I'm the attorney. I work in the university's legal office. And I think both what Suad and Neijma have been saying is a real problem on our campus, because we need to make everyone feel welcomed on our campus and included. And a very important way to do that is through our speech. So one of the ways that the legal office tries to address this problem, because there is a tension, is to educate as to how the harm is real, and therefore how the speech needs to be changed in order to be more inclusive, rather than simply acknowledge that there might be free speech rights which exist under our Constitution, which may not have been written with every Black and brown face in mind. I will certainly acknowledge that. But nevertheless, I think it is a much more productive way for this tension to be resolved if we can work to re-educate people about words in a manner that they use them that allows people to not feel excluded. So the tension is real because there is not always a uniform understanding of what the speech means. People have different backgrounds, whether they're privileged backgrounds or non-privileged backgrounds, majority, minority, exposures. All peoples have different backgrounds which affect how they speak to each other and learn from each other and understand each other. And I think that the way to address this tension has to be through a means of re-educating people as to what the effect of words really are in terms of how people feel they can express themselves and be a part of whatever they are participating in. This is a very important aspect of the university. We don't want people to feel excluded, and they shouldn't feel excluded because they are as much of what we are. There is no we, it is all of us. So that's, even in the way I'm trying to frame this, it's difficult to say because it's a matter of numbers and who's in the majority. But why that is a matter of history and not necessarily a matter of where we should be and want to be as an institution right now. And getting people to that point with laws that are outdated or old or don't reflect the reality of where we are is the tension that we work with every day.
Thank you for that input. Did Captain Mosser or John, did you want to add anything further?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, so I agree with much of what's been said. Thank you, Neijma, Suad, and Diane for your comments. You know, I think one aspect I'll add to this, because, you know, I played two roles, right? You know, I am a faculty member and I'm also Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs. So I see sort of two different levels, I guess, of the issue at times. One university-wide, one more colloquial to my own sort of faculty life. But, you know, I think one issue that I would just bring to the fore is pick up a little bit of where Diane left off, I think, is, you know, faculty often, you know, we take more of a clinical approach, an analytic approach to things like academic freedom, free speech. And, you know, we look at it as a member of a faculty community, we have these rights, right? And the reality is we're trained that way, right? I mean, I'm not condoning sometimes how we come across, but our training is more clinical in nature, and we look at speech and academic freedom as more of a right that's bestowed upon us as academics, right? And I think that sometimes that view gets in the way of having a dialogue, right? And I think it's really critical to recognize and understand that our community is comprised of many different views, many different individuals, and how to engage in those discussions or come across in a respectful, civil way so that we can see each other's viewpoints is absolutely critical. But what I'll say though is, putting my associate provost hat on for a moment, you know, we have tensions that come up to our level because faculty feel like they are unable sometimes to have a conversation without it being taken out of context or somehow being misrepresented, because they'll say things from a, again, analytic, sort of clinical, this is our class, this is our topic perspective, and it doesn't quite come across as intended, right? And I think that's where we end up, at least in that role that I play, with tensions between faculty, staff, and students.
I am Captain Moss, University of Maryland Police Department. What I would add to the conversation first is that I think we need to understand that people come here to the university with their own set of morals, their own set of values, their own biases, their own prejudice. And I think that what leads to some of the tensions here with free speech and inclusion is the fact that I agree with Diane that we do need to educate individuals a little bit better than we have been. I would like to credit ODI and Neijma with some of the efforts that she's been doing and pursuing out here on campus when there is an incident, which University of Maryland Police Department, we respond to all hate bias incidents, and we investigate all hate bias incidents. So when we do respond, we contact Neijma, and Neijma reaches out to those that have been affected. I think it's also important to educate those who are offenders so that we can change that mentality and maybe help to get them to a place where they can understand the impact of what they've done to individuals on campus. So I think education is probably the best way for us to deal with that gap between inclusion and free speech.
Great, thank you everyone for your input. To go on to the next question, given the increase in online activity for work and academics, how has this exacerbated tensions between inclusion and free speech?
Cap Moss here again. I think what I would say is that we went abruptly to an online platform. It wasn't planned, obviously, with COVID. And so what we were seeing initially from a police perspective, what we were seeing was individuals not being able to secure these meetings with Zoom. We got some guidance here from UMPD Div IT, and they put that out. And here recently, with some of the security features that Zoom has been improving upon, and with time, people have become a lot better with securing these types of events. So I haven't seen individuals, I would say in the last month and a half, we haven't had a lot of reports of Zoom bombing type incidents recently. We did come across a lot of issues where jurisdiction is a problem for us now, because individuals are no longer centered on campus in our jurisdiction when these occur. So we had to talk to the Office of the State's Attorney about how do we actually investigate these types of incidents when, for all intents and purpose, it doesn't occur in our jurisdiction. What we were told, our guidance was that Actually, we do not have jurisdiction if the incident did not, the communication did not initiate or terminate here on campus, and that we would have to refer individuals to their local jurisdictions because if not, we don't have legal process. We don't have the ability to get to issue search warrants, subpoenas, or to follow up investigatively on those situations. So that's some of the stuff that we were seeing initially. Now what I'm seeing, and now what I think is going to be a big issue is we're seeing individuals do offensive things online or submit offensive things online, and people are actually calling them out on it. People are actually identifying these individuals, and they are reporting back to their, finding out who they're affiliated with and reporting back to those places where they're affiliated, and expecting them to take action on these individuals. And so I do know that some of that has happened here recently here at University of Maryland with students, or at least a student who did something online in regards to the George Floyd challenge, and that was referred back to the Office of Student Conduct. So that's something that I think is going to press the university to kind of answer where do we go now? What is the scope of our authority when there's individuals who do something off campus in their home, not necessarily related to our jurisdiction? What do we do then? So I think that's something that's emerging right now.
Thank you, Captain Moss, for that. And that point about the jurisdiction issues is very interesting. And I understand that that's something that you're still working on. What are some of the workarounds that you have been able to do to address some of these issues, even though they're outside of the jurisdiction, to either support the victims of hate bias incidents, or to address the perpetrators?
For those Zoom bombing type incidents, what we did was we referred individuals to FBI, because the FBI wanted to be involved in those types of investigations for Zoom bombing type incidents. We also put them in contact with their local jurisdictions. We didn't just tell them, it's not our jurisdiction, go away. We put them in contact with their local jurisdiction so that they could file a formal complaint with that local jurisdiction so that they could follow up. We also make sure that since they are either faculty, staff, or students here at the University of Maryland, we refer them to the bias incident support team so that they can actually get the type of resources that are on campus to kind of help them work their way through problems when they've been affected by these hate bias type incidents.
Great, thank you. And I do want to give the rest of the panelists an opportunity to answer and address the second question. And I'll read it through again just so you can refresh your memory. Given the increase in online activity for work and academics, how has this exacerbated tensions between inclusion and free speech? So anyone else in the panel who wishes to speak, go ahead.
I will speak. I just want to say that there's a lot of screaming kids in the background, so I want to apologize ahead of time. So for me, I think there were sort of two things that really stood out in my world. One was there was definitely this increase in people making online attacks against marginalized folks, and definitely making intentional attempts to make folks not feel included. And I think that increased because now people were not face to face. So people felt, I guess, braver to be able to say things and do things while also being able to be anonymous. I think towards the end, I will give some specific numbers about sort of like trends that we've seen online, but I think that's one of them. So definitely we saw an uptick in particularly anti-Black racist incidents happening. And I think in part being online gave some folks, I guess, some courage, or what, maybe that's not the right word, but feeling braver and bolder. The second thing, as I think about inclusion, was really around students being in their classes and classroom settings. And so there are students that have accommodations and had accommodations. However, once we switched to a virtual setting, it meant that the accommodations that worked in person no longer necessarily worked online, or maybe needed to be tweaked. And I think that there was some tensions around there in terms of, and maybe this is not necessarily answering the question to the free speech part particularly, but as we think about sort of like just bias coming forward in an online setting, I think we had to have some discussions around now that we're in an online setting, what does it mean for our students who may have, accommodations or disabilities? What does it mean for them to feel included? So I think that was two things that we saw as we switched to this virtual platform.
I was going to say that it's really important for all of us to understand that this space, this online space, can still be something within the university's control. If we are talking about classes, behavior in this online space, if it's committed by our students and our staff and faculty, is subject to processes on campus that can lead to discipline. It's not always easy to address in a one-time event, but I do think the university has the ability to continue to put together expectations for online behavior within the work and academic setting that allow us to take advantage of this as a, that's not the right word. Take advantage isn't really the right word. What I mean is that we don't have to accept that this is a different space that we can't control. I mean, Captain Moss is completely right about, if we have Zoom bombing that's outside of our jurisdiction, we may not be able to prosecute or pursue as a hate crime or a hate bias incident. But if we have repeated behavior by our own faculty and staff as part of their academic and work activities, that is something that is within our control for investigation and response. I have to say that it's my experience, and this is somewhat of a personal observation, that treating these matters as disciplinary matters and trying to punish does not always lead to the correct outcome in terms of the outcome being an improved behavior pattern. I personally have seen people become defensive, and it's counterproductive and doesn't serve the purpose of eliminating and ending the problematic behavior, the hate bias behavior. So I don't know that that tactic always works. I think the modeling behavior tactic works better. The expectations of what we want from our students and from our staff and for our faculty seems to work better. But I just wanted to address the fact that it's not always outsiders, unfortunately. And even though our own students might be in other jurisdictions, we might have the ability, because of their activities related to school learning and work, be able to take some form of action related to our own policies and procedures.
Great, thank you for that. I want to give it Suad a chance to chime in as well.
Thank you. Sorry. So I actually wanted to add on to a couple of the opinions mentioned. Because our switch to the online platform, I feel like the university, because of their lack of preparedness for this switch, a lot of focus has been on that and not really on where all of this originates from, and that this is just merely another symptom of the climate and conversations that we are having on campus. We don't really talk at all about hate bias response. We don't really talk about hate speech. We don't talk about any of these topics generally. I can't technically speak for the entire student body, but from what I've seen in terms of the curriculum we've been exposed to as students, we don't really discuss things like this. And the behavior in general, like sentiment towards hate speech and general dislike and general just hate generally to marginalized folks hasn't really been addressed. And there's this general climate of, again, it's the lack of accountability. There's a lot that the university is not involved in when it comes to these type of situations. And even with the several situations on campus, especially with anti-Black sentiment. And I feel like what we do is we accept free speech, but we fail to condone the intentions, and we fail to condone the overall content of the speech. And that is something that is generally more silenced above the general opinion of the campus. I've heard from a lot of friends, I've spoken with a lot of people on campus, and there's this general understanding that when something happens like a hate bias incident, everybody feels some form of remorse, they reach out, but then it disappears and fleets. So I feel like there's never, and even when a hate bias incident occurs, as some have occurred to me at my time at the University of Maryland, there's never a clear understanding as to what should we do next, what can we do next. So I feel like this overall ambiguity has prevented students from acknowledging that hate speech itself is something that is a heavy matter, and that the students who are victims of hate speech feel like they don't have the support from the university. And I think this is also something that I've been trying to reach out to, even as a freshman, as someone who's very strong about racial advocacy and just overall social justice movements. I've failed to be able to establish that connection with higher ups on campus and administration. So I feel like this wide disconnect and this lack of general framework, at least, and transparency for students to have when these type of issues occur is a strong disadvantage for students, and only continues to give people who perform hate speech more room and more comfort to perform it. So I feel like we need to work on that, and we need to make sure that we have clear processes and avenues for students to reach for support, and for students to know, for those who are interested in perpetrating hate speech, to know that they will be held accountable, and just in general, an overall type of education for them to understand what their words mean, and a general social awakening, because I feel like we have not had that yet. And we are reaching a point where hate speech continues, and even now on the online platform, it's continuing. But again, we're not addressing where the root cause is, and we're not addressing the lack of support of vocal advocates on campus fighting for inclusion for Black folks, for Latinx folks and for Indigenous folks, BIPOC on campus. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because I feel like we never know which outlets we can reach out to as students. And if I hadn't known people in the diversity and inclusion office, I wouldn't have been able to get connected to the resources I needed.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Neijma, did
I'm gonna say I think that that's such an important point, Suat, and just to make it clear that the things that we're seeing online, the hate bias incidents and all of that, it didn't start because we switched to a virtual platform, right? There was like already an environment where a lot of this was already occurring, and to your point, an environment where a lot of this was many felt allowed, right? So students sort of switched onto the platform. Then all of a sudden was like, now we're online. I think that I just want to stress that point. Part of it is that the environment was already in place for students to feel bold to be able to do this. So I just wanted to bring that point again, and thank you, Suad, for bringing that up, because I think it's a really critical and key point.
Thank you, Neijma. I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention one more thing. I think on campus, especially, like it may not just be speech, it's also different forms of hate that manifest themselves. So as a student, as a Black Muslim woman who goes and frequents to different, places on campus as a student, in general, like if, especially on South Campus where one of the bus stops were closed in honor of Lieutenant Richard Collins, seeing students, primarily white students, sitting at that bus stop and having to be the only person who intervenes to tell those students to not sit there. And knowing that the university themselves, I actually was walking by and I saw a group of people cleaning the bus stop, and I noticed that it wasn't the university who's cleaning this bus stop. And the fact that Black students like me can walk across campus and see that proper memorials haven't been created for students who have died because of hate crimes is just another symbol of the lack of listening and the lack of acknowledgement of Black pain on campus. And that is definitely something that we need to address, and something that not only I've known and spoken about, but I've had this conversation with a lot of other people on campus. So it's not only just hate speech, it's also hate symbolism and the lack of support given, and the lack of general investment in Black students on campus is also another form of violence.
So I'll just say a couple of things. I don't want to repeat Rose, and thank you, Suad, for sharing that, and also for Neijma for your comments, and thank you actually for the work that your BISS group does, or BISS. I'm not sure which I should say, however you prefer, because I think it actually is a very helpful resource to have on campus to navigate some of these issues, frankly. But when you talk about the movement online, I actually agree with some of what was said. I don't. It highlighted disparities, and it also created more of a disconnection. And I think when you have that disconnection, it enables and amplifies some of the issues that were already present, right? And I think that's what several of the speakers already mentioned. A couple things I'll say though is I also feel that not only did it enable it where it was occurring through our platforms, I would say side by side with that was the use of social media, right? And social media, whether it's the UMD Reddit site or various other places where things are being posted, I think has created a much more difficult path sometimes for matters of inclusion in this kind of environment. And it creates a lot of tensions actually, especially when for faculty on the faculty side, you know, almost all the communication moved online, right? And so a lot of people by email or via posting on the Elm sites, right, Canvas and various other places, and then those would get or partially reposted and retweeted and various other things, and it created a number of challenges for all of our offices actually. But I want to go back to what Diane said about expectations, and I'm going to share a link with you because I think Diane was going in a direction that I wanted to mention. You know, we have actually created through our office a series of faculty expectations and guidelines that I'll share with you momentarily because they transcend the medium, right? So right now we're talking about online, but the expectation for faculty goes beyond whether it's online, right? I mean, these are citizens of our campus, and we have expectations for them, not just as members of our community, but also aspirational expectations for them. And so some of them are in policy, so you can follow that link. And we are working hard, right? I mean, this is going to be integrated into, this is new, by the way. I mean, but we've been working on this for a while, and it will be put into new faculty orientation and a range of other things through our office to try and set expectations. You know, we are part of a community. And we have norms, sometimes existing norms, sometimes historical norms that need to be changed, but also aspirational norms. And that's what this document is intended to try and do, to move the conversation, at least on the faculty realm.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. And if folks haven't seen it, John posted that in the chat box. So we received a few questions from the audience, so we'll just jump into a few of those. One of the questions is, what are the panelists' thoughts on, quote, safe spaces versus, quote, brave spaces? And the questioner says, it seems to me that brave spaces is a step backward.
So I'm not sure in the context of what the person is asking the question, but I can speak for the way that we do things at BISS in terms of safe space, brave space. And I don't necessarily think that we use either. I think that when we invite folks to offer support, we always talk about holding space, right? Period. And I know that there's a lot of literature and language around brave space, safe space. And, you know, we want folks to enter a space feeling brave. We also know that we can't guarantee safety. I think one of the things that we try to do is hold space, period. And when folks come into our office, we try to make sure that that is a space where they feel affirmed, where they feel valued, where they feel seen, where they feel heard. And that's what we really try to do. For me, you know, if you use safe space, if you use brave space, like what are you actually doing when folks get into this space with you is more critical and important for me. I have seen folks say brave space when you get into that space is something else, and vice versa. So for me, I guess what I'm stressing is what are you doing? And what are folks doing when you are in community and space with other people? Are you affirming them? Are you censoring their hurt, their pain. I think that to me is the more critical thing. And that's what we try to focus on in our space and in our office.
Thank you. And Neijma, if you can, just for the audience, if anyone's not familiar with those two terms, would you mind sharing a little bit, like maybe the differences?
So, you know, different people use different terminology. So the idea with safe space is people would say, you know, if you come into this session, whatever, this is a safe space and you can be here. I think the pushback with that has been oftentimes people enter the space and they do not feel safe, or that you really can't guarantee safety because you don't know what's going to happen. Brave space then was another terminology where we can't necessarily guarantee safety, but we do want to come we do want you to come in here and be brave and feel safe to share. I think one thing for me that I have realized is, particularly as it relates to our hate bias incidents, when our students come to meet with us, or faculty or staff, a lot of them have been so traumatized and hurt and dejected. The idea of even being brave is a big ask, right? And so we are very careful in terms of how we are approaching folks. And I think to stress that point, when we talk about impact, I think many people do not realize the psychological impact that hate bias incidents can often have. And to ask someone to even be brave and to say that this is a brave space, that after something like that has happened to them, is really big. And so we are like, come as you are, and we will affirm you wherever you are, as you are.
Great, thank you. And any of the other panelists wish to chime in on brave space versus safe space, or just going back to Neijma's point of how are we affirming students who are coming to you all with hate bias incidences?
So I'd love to give my opinion about safe spaces, because safe versus brave spaces. So in my general understanding and from curriculum and being on different grassroots organizations, safe spaces were created for marginalized students to be able to connect with each other, to have their voices heard, to basically share experiences, and to have a space where they could exist without the singular narrative that society pushes, which is generally a narrative that does not represent the experiences and the hardships faced by marginalized folks. So that is generally a safe space. And then for the brave space, it's more of placing it in a more academic setting where there are people of privilege present in the academic setting, and they generally want to conduct dialogue where they can break down their different forms of understanding of privilege and misconceptions that they have about marginalized folks and about social justice. So the danger about brave spaces, however, is brave spaces places a lot of work and a lot of emotional and psychological stress on marginalized folks, because to have all the right answers and basically to provide all the information and re-educate privileged folks in that space. So it takes a lot of energy, and it drains marginalized people because they're forced to relive their trauma, like Neijma said, and they're forced to have to put their own comfort aside and basically take privileged folks on this journey of reawakening. And so that's the danger of brave spaces, because at the end of the day, they exhaust marginalized folks as they are expected to be educators to their privileged peers. And generally in those spaces, they are often having to fight and prove that and have to validate their experience to people who generally invalidate their experiences. So gaslighting, and gaslighting is basically this understanding where somebody tries to invalidate your experience because they don't personally understand it or believe it. And just because you don't understand and you can't relate to an experience because you come from a place of privilege doesn't mean that it's not a correct experience and is being experienced constantly by people who are marginalized. Oppression. So I just wanted to clarify that, and I just wanted to say that brave spaces generally place a lot of strain on marginalized folks. So despite the work that is being done in those spaces, at the end of the day, Black voices, BIPOC voices, thank you for who explained that and gave a definition in the chat, are generally being absorbed, and their energy is generally being drained in those spaces. So I as someone who is a Black Muslim woman, have navigated being in those spaces, and imagine like as a student being in a classroom where your teacher, you have to explain something to your teacher, you have to explain something as the only often person of color or person who looks like you in a room. It's kind of a very daunting task, and it's honestly a lot to ask from so a great alternative to brave spaces is just listening to Black voices and listening to marginalized voices, and then making sure that you are doing your own research, you are learning on your own, and make sure that you're not learning through the cost of a marginalized person's energy, mental stress, and their overall well-being.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Excellent point. Unless anyone else in the panel wanted to jump in, I can move on to the next question from the audience. Okay. So next question from the audience. Curious if the panel has any thoughts on the quote, Karen laws or statutes beginning to be instituted regarding making false accusations or trying to use the police force as a weapon against oppressed populations.
Neela, could you repeat that question?
Sure. The question is, does the panel have any thoughts on the quote, Karen laws or statutes beginning to be instituted regarding making false accusations or trying to use the police force as a weapon against oppressed populations?
Well, as an officer, I am all for prosecuting individuals that make false police reports. That's not anything new. We've done that here at the University of Maryland Police Department. We have charged people, I personally have charged people with making false police reports on individuals. So me personally, I have absolutely nothing against it. I think that is the direction that we need to be going for individuals. I think there needs to be consequences and repercussions for individuals that utilize our resources when it's unnecessary at someone else's peril.
I was just going to chime in that I agree with everything that we're hearing from our representative from the police department. And I think many people on our campus don't realize the number of activities on campus that our police are involved in. And we have precious few resources, in the sense resources are people, and people and their time, and the time spent trying to investigate or respond or look into a false allegation is going to take time away from real allegations that we definitely are interested in. I've been with the university a very long time now, and over the course of many police officer chiefs and presidents, I've seen a continued interest in having the police support our campus and legitimately investigating real problems on the campus, including hate crimes or problems under the criminal law that affect people of color in particular. But more recently, I have seen and support using our police force to look into campus inclusion and diversity activities, being a part of processes that affect our campus, which may not be crimes, but because our police force is involved as both a legitimate police force and police force for our campus, they support and work with activities that the university is promoting, and we want those activities to be safe and inclusive. So when we take the resources of the few police that we have, I mean, we have a very nice force of decent size, but we don't have a force that has extra resources. But so when we use that force to support investigations that go off and are wasting their time, I really think that that's a problem, because we need to make sure that our community understands and appreciates the time and energy that our police force is putting into keeping the whole campus safe. And that definitely includes, as I was trying to say, in more recent times, efforts to have the police force support the views of the campus in terms of diversity and inclusion. That would include, you know, supporting our current president, supporting our past president who created the new Office of the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. All of these things and the programs that are supported have police support in terms of activities, forums, things where there might be problematic behavior.
I would also like to add, not only what I fully agree that and support and think that folks definitely need to have consequences. I also think that there are many people who engage in those kinds of behaviors that do not necessarily involve the police force. So it might be that you're doing things like reporting to HR, you're reporting to OCRSM, you're reporting to the Office of Student Conduct, and you are a white person who are using these university systems that are in place to make false accusations against people of color, and it may not necessarily be the police. I also think that there needs to be systems in place for folks who abuse those systems. Even our office, the Bias Incident Support, making false reports that involve marginalized folks and people of color. So not only do I support when you are wasting the police resources, but all of the resources that people use and abuse against people of color.
Just a quick comment on that, because Neijma, thank you for raising that, because I wanted to extend this beyond police involvement. So one thing just to point out is some of the recent policies that we have put in, or the Senate, you know, puts into effect and President signs, have included language about good faith allegations and consequences to those who may not put forward an allegation in good faith, right? And so the idea was, so we've done this in various misconduct policies. And so the idea was to also have consequences for those individuals who have put forward false allegations, because we didn't want it to just be something that was limited to police involvement, but also in these other ancillary investigative that are through Neijma's office, my office, other offices across campus, so that we communicate to our community that it's incredibly important and ethical and whatnot to engage in these types of behaviors, to put forward allegations in good faith, right? So thank you for raising that, Neijma. I think it's an important point.
I think I want to add on to what Neijma and John were mentioning. I definitely agree with the concept of making sure that we are reaching and using other resources aside the police department to solve issues like this. It first puts a lot of effort and a lot of work on the police department, but we definitely should be focusing on different resources. And from the student perspective, I've had my own experiences in the past with UMPD on campus where I was stopped and basically questioned to show where my ID was. When another student walked right by me, I remember leaving my dorm on my way to class and eventually being late to class because I was stopped by an officer who kept questioning to ask where my ID was. And there was a student that had walked by me, and he was a white male. And I basically asked the officer why he didn't stop that student for his ID and to show his identification. But then another police officer basically had to drag that other officer away from me. And I remember there have been countless experiences with me on campus where I have to specifically avoid certain alleyways on my way to class because I have to run across campus as a computer science major and doing my minor as well. And there are certain alleyways that I've marked to make sure that I don't go in those alleyways because I often find cop cars there and they often ask me where I'm going. And I've responded in the past explaining that I'm on my way to class, but sometimes that answer isn't enough. And I noticed this even from my freshman year, but it particularly got more spiked during my sophomore year. And just in general, like this constant discomfort of police officers when they see large groups of Black students exiting buildings and going to different places, and just in general movement on campus. So that level of anxiety that it gives people is something that a student shouldn't have to worry about, and is something that I feel is incredibly important. But I'm not sure if there are any initiatives in place to deal with this, but definitely calling police officers to deal with situations can also cause like harm to students and can risk causing traumatic experiences for Black students like me and other students on campus.
Suad, I'd like to respond to that. What I would like to say is, number one, sorry that you experienced that. But secondly, if those types of incidents are happening to you, you need to contact the police department. We have things in place where we have checks and balances on officers. We have our own internal affairs where we actually conduct investigations on officers. And we would get back to you on those types of incidents. So please, you, your friends, everybody that's listening, if there is an issue with an officer, we can't handle it if you don't bring it to us. So if you bring it to us, we will handle it. Secondly, I think that people might not realize how heavily involved police officers are in this university. Yes, I have been speaking from a police officer perspective, but I also am a part of this university. I also, I sit on the BISS team. I sit on the beta team. I also liaise with OCRSM, Title IX. So we're all working together constantly all the time. Those things that Diane and that Neijma were talking about as far as referring people to Office of Student Conduct, Office of Faculty Affairs, or UHR, we're the ones that are conducting those investigations and are forwarding those things up. So we're heavily involved. We wear two hats. It's not just we deal with the criminal justice system, but we also deal administratively on campus. So I like everybody to know that too. So there is, like Diane was saying, limited resources. But if you ever have any issues like that with officers where you feel like something unjust happened, please contact us. there's a spot right on our website where you can go and file a complaint.
Thank you, Suad, for sharing that and your vulnerability and sharing that your experiences, and thank you, Captain Moss, for explaining that there are internal reviews that is being done in UMPD. We are short on time, but I do want to sneak in one more audience question before we wrap up. There have seen growing white supremacist and fascist underground organizing and recruitment, as well as public postering and flyering on campus. Beyond filing reports with ODI and BISS, what else can we do? And we'll only have time for maybe one or two panelists.
Captain Moss, do you want to go?
I'm going to need the question again.
Sure, no problem. It is, there has, on campus, there's seen growing white supremacist and fascist underground organizing and recruitment, as well as public postering and flyering on campus. Beyond filing reports with ODI and BISS, what else can we do?
All of those incidents, I can tell you because I'm in charge of investigation, all of those incidents that are reported to the University of Maryland Police Department are thoroughly investigated. And if there's any action that we can take, we do take it. So we go out, we canvass the area, we make sure that we pull down all of those, all of that propaganda. And if there's a crime that actually took place, like malicious destruction of property, we're seeking out those individuals, and we're seeking to bring them to the criminal justice system. If it occurred where that person was affiliated with the university, then we would go through the proper resource at the university to deal with that type of situation. So I can assure you that each and every one of those incidents are being investigated, and these individuals are charismatic, and they are looking, and like the person said, they are recruiting, and they wouldn't be here recruiting if there weren't some response at some point from some people on campus. So we are investigating those incidents as they occur. I can't promise you that we're going to arrest someone, but we are investigating.
So just as a final thought, I think to answer that question, in addition to reporting to all the various structures, whether it's UMPD, BISS, ODI, Office of Student Conduct. So I think that that's one way to think about it. Like when these incidents happen, whether it's flyering or some putting up flyers or whatever. I also think it's really important that as someone asks, what can we do? As we think about how we respond to these incidents, it's really important that we are censoring those who have been impacted. I think oftentimes, which I'm not saying it's not important, that we do put a lot of time and energy into the offenders and thinking about how can we, arrest them and do whatever to the offenders. And I often find that that is time and energy that we could be spending or also spending supporting marginalized folks, because what I found when I came on this campus that we were spending so much time thinking about what we needed to do to offenders that marginalized students and faculty and staff were feeling unheard, unnoticed, and as though their experiences did not matter. And so I think finding ways to center folks while also thinking about and advocating for and making reports. But I think a big part of what we can also do is how do we hold space? How do we center those who have been impacted and harmed? And how do we ensure that they get healing? Because one thing that I can tell you is when you make a report, even when someone has been arrested, or which I think needs to happen, I think sometimes we forget that there also needs to be work done on the folks who have been impacted. And so I think if you are a person and you're like, I've done all I can do, I've made all the reports that I can make, think about what are the ways that I can center these folks who have been impacted and help them in their journey to healing. So that would be one thing that I would offer.
Thank you. That was an excellent point and an excellent final point. Now that we're beyond 2 o'clock, I wanted to thank all of the panelists, Suad, Diane, John, Captain Moss, and Neijma. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your insight. And thank you to the audience for your time as well and for your thoughtful questions. And I hope everyone has a really good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.